You're listening to Super Flexology, a Superflex-focused fantasy football podcast with your hosts John Bauer and Mitch Sorensen.
We are finally back with another episode of the Super Flexology Fantasy Football Show, a proud member of the Full-Time Fantasy Network. I'm your host, John Bauer. You can find me on Twitter at The Bauer Club. As always, I'm joined by Mitch Sorensen, and that's at DynoMC on Twitter. What's going on, Mitch? It's been a few weeks since we spent some time focusing on Dynasty.
It has, and I've been looking forward to this one, too. I always love the rebuild shows that I listen to, so it's going to be finally good to actually talk about it myself.
Yeah, I didn't really think this out as the season approached and I had a new baby on the way. I think I bit off a little more than I could chew, and I said, we'll do 2 episodes a week, and then the editing, and then on top of work and the new baby. So one reason why we've only been doing these Super Flexology fantasy football shows, not on a weekly basis, but what is it, every 3 weeks, every 4 weeks at this point?
Yeah, it's right around there. We definitely bit off a little bit more than we could chew. But, it's our first year doing it, so just live and learn.
We live and we learn, and we will make adjustments moving forward. But let's jump right into it. So a few weeks ago, we looked at things from not only a dynasty perspective, but from the eye of a contender. So tonight, we're going to look at things from the eye of the rebuilder. If you're not contending, in my mind, you're essentially in a rebuild. What are your views on this, Mitch? So oftentimes you'll see things on Twitter or you'll see people post polls and ask questions. What do you consider a rebuild? Because some people see it strictly as I'm blowing a team up. It's a rebuild. But for me personally, I think there's different phases of rebuild.
Yeah, in my opinion, it's just any team that isn't going to be making the playoffs that doesn't have a whole bunch of picks already lined up. Because I think if you have a decent team already and you have a whole bunch of picks lined up, I don't really consider that a rebuild so much because you're just kind of playing for next year and you plan on being a contender then. So you don't need to go into rebuild mode because you kind of have already done that process.
I completely agree. And the way I look at it, so there are 2 different types of rebuilds. There is a complete blow it up type situation. And I'm in a few leagues where I took that upon myself. We had the startup prior to this 2019 season. I absolutely hated the way things were going so far this season, and I decided to absolutely blow it up. But then there is a partial rebuild. And like you said, I'm not looking at it. If I have picks lined up for next year or 2021, and I have a nice young core, I'm not really looking at that as a rebuild. When we're talking about these partial rebuilds, it's a situation where you came into the 2019 season expecting to be able to compete, and maybe you move future picks around, you move some younger guys for win now players, and it didn't really pan out. And maybe you're sitting at 2-6 or, whatever the situation might be, and it's time to make some moves.
Yeah, I think and you have to look at why you're in the rebuild in the first place. Like if you had a team in Superflex going into this year and you had Roethlisberger, Foles, and anyone else, your team's going to be awful. I have a team just like that, and it's not that I'm going to be rebuilding for next year. It's that I'm just going to have to move a couple of vets around so I get a little bit younger at some positions, but I know I'm going to be okay going into next year already.
I'm really glad you brought that up in that specific situation. There are times when it's not necessarily a rebuild. Maybe you have some pieces that aren't producing the way you expected, or you suffered some injuries, like a Nick Foles, Ben Roethlisberger type situation, and you're not necessarily going to compete in 2019. You might really not have to make any moves to put yourself in a good situation. You just kind of have to let those injuries heal over time.
Yeah, definitely. And then there's, the other ones to where you were just wrong. My worst team that I have this year, I thought it was a contender going into the year, but we did the startup draft all the way back last December, and the team's just horrible. And about 3 weeks ago, I decided I had to absolutely just blow it up because that team wasn't just 1 year away. If I kept with the same point and just try to add one piece or 2 pieces, it would turn into a 5 or 6 year rebuild, and that's nothing anyone wants to do.
Right. I think of the situations where people do completely blow it up, you really have to focus on keeping a few key players to be the core of that team. I see people, especially the offseason leading up to 2019, and people were in their startups. And everybody, you saw this, Mitch, everybody wanted to acquire those 2020 picks. So they were either moving back or they were just moving a pick straight up for 2020 draft capital. And there are teams that have absolutely no core, but they have so many 2020 picks. That's a situation where if those don't hit, you're looking, like you said, possibly 3 to 4 years out, because that's going to be it's a full rebuild in that situation.
Yeah, that's one to where you're donating to the pot, as we, call it all off season for the next 5 years, and doing $50 a pop. You're paying $250 to try to have a competing team, after year 6.
I know a lot of people too that do that. They look at it and they think, that's the way they enjoy to play Dynasty. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think it's important that if you're going to focus on the future, that's fine. But you can still have pieces that are going to help you now or pieces that you can build around. And I think that's really important. With all that said, we kind of got into the next question that I was going to ask you. It's a really straightforward question, and the answer should be very straightforward. Why are you entering a rebuild? So on tonight's show, I kind of want to talk about the what, the why, and the how. And I think the how is the most critical, but what's the situation? Why are you entering a rebuild? And again, we kind of touched on it a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it's super important to know too, because I look at it as if my team isn't championship caliber and it's not going to continue being that way for future years, I'm okay with it being, a one-off championship contender and then going into the rebuild. But that's not really what I'm striving for in Dynasty. I want a team that's going to challenge it for multiple years in a row. You can't avoid injuries and AB going insane and stuff like that. But that's what I'm looking for in a team. And if I don't see it, if my team's not able to do that, then I'm already willing to enter the rebuild. But like you said, it doesn't mean we just have to go in and just blow it up because we're entering the rebuild.
Yeah, and there's a few situations, and one league in particular, I actually have 6-20-20 first. It's a 14-team Superflex league. My team, I think it was floating around 9th or 8th, and I was still competing, but when you look at the top teams, it wasn't going anywhere. And I looked at it, and if you're not able to contend, we've already mentioned that several times in this episode already, if you're not able to contend, you need to start looking ahead and look at your next move. And I think a lot of people in Dynasty, they are so short-sighted, and that's why when we still talk about Dynasty values, we talk about short-term outcomes because there are huge implications that have long-term value effects. Like I said, if your team is not contending, and this could be due to injury or simply underperforming assets or changing values from the time that you did your startup. You talked about a team earlier where the startup was in December and the pieces that you went after, they just really haven't been successful. That's probably the most difficult rebuild in my mind because it's the first year after the startup and you went after the players that you wanted. You specifically targeted those players and their value is plummeted. So you can't even move them. And I'm talking about maybe a Kerryon Johnson. That's kind of due to injury in the situation. Maybe a Joe Mixon who just hasn't produced. So you look at players like this and it's like, do you kind of hang on to them? Do you look to move them, but you're not going to get the value that you initially wanted? And I know that one thing that people have trouble with, and Mitch, I think you can attest to this too, from what you've seen, especially the first year after a startup, people have a huge problem. They have a lot of trouble adjusting their values accordingly based on what's happened so far.
Yeah, we see it all the time is, well, I drafted this person in the 3rd round back in June or back in January, and it doesn't matter what draft capital you put into him. It's over at this point, and you have to adjust for what's going on the field.
Yeah, and I brought up Joe Mixon, and we're not really going to talk about specific players. And the reason that we're not going to do that, Mitch, you and I talked before the show, and we thought, okay, should we go through players and talk about players that we're looking to buy if we're in a rebuild or players that we're looking to sell? Well, the guys that we're looking to sell, a lot of them are pretty obvious. I think it's aging veterans that you're not looking to keep on your team next year. Or if you're in a complete rebuild, it's guys that might be at peak value that you're looking to split up into multiple assets. So we wanted to avoid talking about specific players because in some leagues, and Mitch, you've seen this so many times, you might have a player that looks like a nice dynasty buy low. And a few weeks ago, that would have been Juju Smith-Schuster. But in a lot of situations, people have not adjusted their values and still see him at the same place they took him in startups or maybe the price they paid to acquire him. So again, that's why we wanted to avoid specific players because that's so league specific and very owner specific. So something that we wanted to avoid. But I think talking more about the types of players is going to be much more valuable. And I see it more as obviously evergreen content that you're going to be able to use year to year. We hit on the what, we hit on the why. Now, again, this is kind of the meat of the show here, the how. Mitch, what are some overall strategies that you look at when entering a rebuild, or maybe you're already in one? So how do you effectively go about rebuilding a dynasty team?
I think the first thing you have to do is look at the league activity, because like we said, every league is going to be different. We're going to talk about a little bit later what to do in an inactive league. There's leagues who really prefer running backs. We're both in a league like that where running backs have insane values. And there's other ones where people just hoard quarterbacks, or you have one guy who has all of the rookie draft picks. And so you're going to have to adjust how you're going to rebuild, and then also how quickly it's going to happen if it's kind of a dead league.
So 2 points there. And I'm really glad you brought it up. If it's a dead league, and somebody asked this on Twitter, and I was really glad they asked it, and I wish there was a better answer, and maybe you have one, Mitch, but for me, you have to be patient. If you're in a dead league, it is so easy to find the few active owners and they send you an offer. Maybe you negotiate a little bit back and forth, but it's so easy to pull the trigger too quickly because you're getting impatient and you look at your team and think, oh gosh, I have to start rebuilding because it's going nowhere fast. So the biggest mistake that you can make in a league where it's not as active as you would like, you have to be patient and you have to wait for the opportunities. So if you're looking to rebuild in an inactive league, you really have to look at your competition and the teams in the league. So constantly, if I'm looking to move assets and I'm looking to unload maybe a Saquon Barkley, for example, and I'm looking to diversify that asset into multiple pieces, you want to look at teams that maybe lost a running back in that situation. Or if you have a Gardner Minshew or Ryan Tannehill, you really want to look around the league with all the quarterback injuries. There's bound to be somebody that's down to one quarterback. That is the perfect time to strike and move an asset like that. So I think, again, in an inactive league, you have to be patient, you have to be opportunistic, and you really have to monitor the other teams and look where they're lacking. If there's a big injury in the league, you have to see who owns that player. And if they're a contender, you might be able to move an asset that's going to help you in the long run and help that contender in the short run. That's what we're looking at if it's an inactive league. Do you have anything else there besides, being patient?
No, that pretty much covered it, because that's all you can do. In hyperactive leagues, you could turn around a team in a year. You could turn it around in a couple months if you're really active and you have other players trading. But if
you did that. In the league that we met, we did the startup. What was that? Prior to the 2018 season.
Yes.
And you made some moves and your team wasn't competing. So you moved assets very quickly. And that's a super active league. So it's very easy to do. But you flipped a ton of players for 2019 picks at that time. And then once that draft approached, you moved those players. And I think you're the second leading scorer in the league this year.
I think I'm top 4 now after this week, but I'm not winning any games, but I'm scoring a lot of points. So at least I'll make the playoffs as a wild card. But yeah, that's a really good example of what you could do in hyperactive leagues. But if you're in an inactive league, you can't do that. And so you have to be willing to go at it in a 3 or 4 year period. Because even if you hit on all of your draft picks, even, your 4th round pick is really good, those 4 players aren't going to go in and just instantly change you into a contender. So 2 or 3 years of that, you're going to be okay. But the one problem about an inactive league is if you miss on those rookie draft picks, then you're putting yourself that much further behind the 8 ball.
So what are your thoughts? Well, I already know your thoughts, but I want you to share for the listeners. If you are in that situation, even if you are considering your team a rebuild, so you have a 2020 draft pick and it's an inactive league, and like you said, you better hit on that draft pick. Is there any chance that you're looking to move that pick once the 2020 draft comes for a more proven asset?
Yeah, I'll do that in any league that I can. I would much rather have a proven asset than a rookie.
Right. And especially in a league that's not active and you have to hit on it. If you don't, you're set back a few more years. It just isn't fun, to be honest with you, especially in an inactive league. Now, in a hyperactive league, or one where we're making a lot of trades and there's a lot of activity, you can miss on a few trades. And God knows you and I have both been there. But if it's an active league, if you're always making moves and you're trying to stay ahead of values, while you might miss a few, as long as you're hitting on some, it's more than you're missing, you're going to be okay. And you're able to recoup those losses in an active league much quicker than you would in an inactive league. But unfortunately, in an inactive league, you're not going to know how it is until it's too late. Maybe people are making a lot of moves in the startup, but then after the startup, everybody disappears. Now, one other thing that I do want to talk about, and you mentioned it, so hoarding picks, and every league has at least one person like that. Like I said, in one of the leagues, I'm like that. I have 6 20 21st. if you had a startup prior to the 2019 season, there is probably going to be at least one person that has several of the picks, especially in deeper leagues. Mitch, we've seen people, they might have 6, 7, 8 first round picks and they have nobody really to build around. Those are going to be situations where it's going to be really tough to effectively rebuild by the 2020 season. I think you've seen that as well.
Yeah, and I think there's hope during the draft at those, because I have about 4 leagues that I have well over 6 2020 picks in, first rounders. How I look at it is I'm not going to just draft rookies with those picks. I am going to try to trade some for veterans and get some rookies along with it too. But the problem is you're going to have to wait until that pick is on the clock. So like you said, it's not going to be until May until you could actually start your rebuild that you want to start to do, in November of this year.
And especially in this upcoming 2020 draft, there are going to be so many opportunities. If you do have picks in the first, second, hell, even maybe the third round, you are going to be able to move those for veterans. And one example that I want to throw out, and this is very anecdotal, it's very specific to one situation that I saw in the 2019 rookie drafts, but there was an owner, they had Alshon Jeffrey, obviously a declining asset, but still very usable. And this was a 14-team league, keep in mind. So especially in that format where you have to start 3 wide receivers, you're looking at 42 receivers. Alshon Jeffrey is still a top 42 wide receiver for fantasy purposes. Anyway, they moved Alshon Jeffrey for a 2019 third, and the rest of the league was not happy. And they said, I'm rebuilding. Alshon Jeffrey is not going to help me. So the moral of that story is just because you're entering a rebuild, or maybe you're in a full-blown rebuild, don't move aging pieces for the sake of moving them. You still need to be focused on the value you're getting in return. So you're looking to move those aging veterans. Make sure you're getting something that's going to be useful. Not to say that 2019 third wasn't useful, but there's something more valuable that you could have gotten in return. And another thing that I look at when I'm entering a rebuild or I'm in the middle of one, not just aging assets, but who are some guys that you have on your roster that have short-term value? And yes, it might turn into long-term value, which you're not necessarily going to know. But if you can move these short-term pieces to a contender that just suffered an injury, maybe it's a Carlos Hyde, maybe it's from a quarterback perspective, Gardner Minshew, the jury's still out there from a long-term perspective. But again, I mentioned a Ryan Tannehill. So yes, they're not really the aging veterans necessarily like an Alshon Jeffrey, or if you're looking at a higher value of Julio Jones, but these are guys that can help contenders. A couple weeks ago, Mitch, we talked about Larry Fitzgerald and Mohamed Sanu. From a contender's perspective, I'm buying them, but you're looking to sell them as a rebuild. So those are the aging veterans, but the guys that have short-term value at this point, who knows if he has short-term or long-term value, but Kenyon Drake, he just made the move to Arizona and there's going to be a value spike. And I think that's something to keep in mind too. And Mitch, maybe you can chime in a little bit more on this, but if you have a guy on your roster and he got traded or in the offseason he gets moved, he signs a free agent contract somewhere else, I typically see a spike in value regardless of if they're going to a better or worse situation.
Yeah, I think it's an immediate move. I made that mistake this year. It's something that I even made you spend a couple 2020 firsts in our co-owned leagues on Duke Johnson.
Well, let me clarify for the listeners. It was not multiple 2020 firsts. It was multiple leagues where we moved one 2020 first, yes, just to clarify.
Multiple leagues. About all of my leagues, then the co-owned leagues with you as well. And, when I bought into that, and I think that's something that a lot of people buy into as well, is we see the new situation, we see the market share and the target share, and we buy into that without thinking, one more move can completely tank this person's value. So it's something you got to be really careful with. But like you were bringing up earlier about that Alshon Jeffrey point, is you don't only have to have young players on your team if you're doing a rebuild. Buying someone like Marvin Jones, doesn't have a lot of dynasty value, but he's going to be a weekly piece for you next year if you need him. And getting guys like that, they're not going to cripple your rebuild at all to have a 28, 29-year-old, wide receiver 3 on your team. And there's no reason to trade those guys for super cheap for, like you said, round 3 or round 4 pick, just because you want to have that pretty rookie sitting on your bench for the next 4 years.
How many times have you seen, and it could be a league chat, it could be Twitter, somebody will post a poll, and let's use Devontae Adams, for example. What is he, 26 years old? So obviously he's over the hill already, but he's involved in a trade poll and it clearly isn't the necessary value in return, but they'll add to it, oh, well, I'm rebuilding. You're allowed to have these 26-year-old wide receivers, or even, if you have a 26 or 27-year-old running back on your roster. Yes, the running back situation a little bit different, and we'll get to that in a little bit. You're looking to move them just because the landscape, it really is going to change, especially starting in 2020. But wide receivers, you don't need to take a hit in value just because you're rebuilding. Like you said, Mitch, you don't have to focus on building around rookies and second-year players. You're allowed to have these veterans that have been around that are going to be productive when healthy. You don't have to go all out and completely blow it up. And we've talked about that already. You're allowed to have pieces to build around to have a strong core. So I think that's a really great point you made. You don't necessarily need to have strictly young players just because it is a rebuild. Now, if you are in a rebuild, and this might be a situation where you blew it up a little bit more. It's not just a few pieces that you're looking to turn over going into next year. If you're not competing this year, don't handcuff yourself and limit yourself to making a move that's going to help you in the long run just because of the way it makes your team look today. So one specific example, don't be afraid to move a running back just because it might take you down to 2 startable running backs today. And I've had situations like that. Somebody's towards the bottom of the league, they're not competing this year, and you're offering something that's going to help them in the long run. And they say, nah, I need that third running back. What are you saving it for? You're not competing this year. Do something that's going to help your team. One situation might be you're looking at a player like Le'Veon Bell, and he's one of your starting running backs right now, but you're towards the bottom of the league for one reason or another. And somebody offers you, a first and 2 seconds at this point. I think that's kind of fair with what's been going on. Don't be afraid to pull the trigger just because it puts you in a bad situation this year when you're already not competing. Again, this is Dynasty. We need to look at it from a longer term perspective. Don't be so short-sighted. So we did, like I said, we had a few questions pop up on Twitter. And the one, it was, how do you rebuild in an inactive league? So hopefully we provide some insight there. And Mitch, I have another question for you. And you kind of answered this already on Twitter, but I want to throw it on here as well. Somebody asked, at what point do you take into account how many picks you have versus how many players you have to draft and drop? So what are your thoughts on that?
I just don't think that it matters until that last pick you have is on the clock. Let's say you have 8 total picks during the draft and you have 24 players that you really like. I never plan on drafting all 8 players if I have 8 picks. I'm going to try to trade some of those picks and combine them and to try to get a better vet, including players on my roster as well. And so I never worry about that until the very, if I have my squad of 28 that I really like and I have a couple of picks left, just throw it up and say, hey, whoever gives me the best price for this pick, you're going to get it. And usually you can always get the next year's pick at that. If you're trading a 2020 third, you will always be able to get a 2021 third for it. So it's not even really a loss. You're just kind of pushing it off for one more year if you absolutely have to do that.
I was going to say one thing that I've done, if there's a situation that I do have too many picks and maybe it's the tail end of a draft and it was a 2019 fifth, you're going to be able to move it. You might even be able to move it for a 2020 fourth if there's a player that for some reason somebody absolutely loves. So you're able to gain, that round in draft equity next year. Or like you said, you're going to be able to consolidate these picks, move them for assets. You don't have to worry about having to cut down. But what I've seen, you really only have to worry about that if it's a 12-team league or less. If you're in a 14 or 16-team league and you're a person that acquired so many picks that this is an issue, a lot of your roster, sad to say, they're probably droppable pieces. So I think you do have to find a balance, and I wish there was a more clear-cut answer, and you have to pay attention to that. But I agree with you. You shouldn't be fretting about this, especially in between the NFL draft and your rookie draft. When the value of those picks increases, even 3rd, 4th, 5th round picks, you should be able to move those and package those up for valuable assets. So I think that's a strong take there, Mitch. Going more into the how, I want to look at it from a positional perspective. We're going to go through the positions. We're going to do quarterback, running back, and let's lump wide receiver and tight end together because they're somewhat similar from a dynasty perspective. What are you doing with each position? And again, like we said earlier, we want to avoid specific players just because they are so league and owner specific. We want to give some things that are a little bit broader.
So leading into the quarterbacks, how much do you factor in quarterback ages when it comes to a rebuild?
I like this one because you talk about rebuilds and you talk about people that are looking at the future, and everybody thinks you have to have those really young quarterbacks. Well, look around. You're seeing quarterbacks play well into their upper 30s, even their 40s, and you don't necessarily need to target the 21 to 25-year-old quarterbacks. And two examples that I'm going to throw out, Matthew Stafford and Matt Ryan. They're 30 and 34 at this point. They are going to be starters in this league for at least the next 3 to 5 years. So I am perfectly fine with building around them, and you're going to be able to get a discount on them. Now, once we go a little bit higher, so we're looking at Phillip Rivers, Ben Roethlisberger, Drew Brees, Tom Brady, I'm going to draw the line there a little bit, and I think you and I might disagree on that a little bit. But yeah, I'm okay bringing on these quarterbacks that are a little bit older. Like I said, a Matt Ryan or Matthew Stafford or Russell Wilson. I might even do Aaron Rodgers too, just because I do think he has a few more years left at a really high level, and you can build around them and use them as a core to work off of. But yeah, the guys, Brees, Brady, Rivers, Ben, I'm still staying away from them from the rebuild perspective.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. Those 4 guys I won't touch because they could be gone. They could be gone before the startup of 2020 season. That's not a risk I'm willing to take. But like you were bringing, Stafford's a good point. So I went through and broke down, my quarterback tiers over the weekend. And I don't really want to get into specific players, but if you look at Stafford and Sam Darnold, in a dynasty sense, they kind of have the exact same value. But in people's minds, Darnold is younger, so he's going to have a little bit of more value, when I could care less if I have Darnold or Stafford on my team going to next year. The quarterback points are probably going to be pretty close to the same weekly, but I just don't see any point in trading away Stafford in order just to get younger at the position, when it really doesn't matter at the end of the day if the guy's 34 or if he's 23.
And I'm glad that you brought this up, because one thing that I think would be very useful in a rebuild, especially in super flex leagues or 2 quarterback, you have a young quarterback that you're probably building around. Let's say it's a Lamar Jackson. Let's say, for me, Josh Allen, Baker Mayfield. You can still probably move a Baker Mayfield for a Matthew Stafford plus. So then you have Baker Mayfield and somebody else has a Matthew Stafford, and they're willing to add 2020 first. That's going to help your rebuild a lot faster than just hanging on to a Baker Mayfield. What are your thoughts there? Not so much the specific players there, because I know you hate Baker, but what are your thoughts on maybe moving a younger quarterback for one of these veterans while gaining extra draft capital, or maybe a younger player thrown in there as well?
That's a great point. I'm even willing to move someone like you brought up, building around Lamar Jackson. I'm okay moving Lamar Jackson or Mahomes or Carson Wentz or any of those guys, because at the end of the day, we're really bad at projecting who's going to be one of the top 5 quarterbacks of the year. We were having arguments if Lamar Jackson was going to be QB1, and it ends up he is the QB1. It's really hard to tell who is going to be one of those top 12 or one of the top 5 quarterbacks. I just want one that's a top 15. And if I could get 2 of them that are in the top 15, I'm completely okay with that. So if I could trade Lamar Jackson and pick up a couple picks and go all the way down to even below Stafford and get Jacoby Brissett, so I would do that if it's going to give me some more ammo in the draft.
And we talk about the different league sizes, 12, 14, 16 team leagues. I think trades like that might be a little more beneficial in the 14 or 16 team leagues, where you're looking to diversify and split up these higher end assets. So earlier we talked about moving a Saquon Barkley. If you're in a rebuild, that's going to be much more beneficial in a larger league where depth is really hard to come by. But in a 12 team league, it's still going to help you, especially if you're in a full blown rebuild. But just be careful when looking at these. The bigger the league, the more starters per team, the deeper the rosters. That's when you need to start looking at diversifying your assets and making moves where you're able to get 2 or 3 pieces for one, and maybe a mid-tier quarterback plus some younger assets or some additional draft capital for that higher end younger asset that right now, I mean, we look at mock drafts that are going on. Lamar Jackson, I think, is a top 3 quarterback right now in mocks and in dynasty mock drafts. And Baker Mayfield was still top 6 even after what we've seen so far this season. So those young guys, they're maintaining their value. You're going to be able to find somebody in a league, even if you're in a rebuild, this is going to help kickstart that, in my opinion.
Yeah, definitely. This is only for quarterbacks. I don't like to do that for running backs or wide receivers, but I think with quarterbacks, because the scoring is just so flat, there's not a huge difference between quarterback, say 6 and quarterback 16. You might get 1 or 2 points a game tops. And so that's where you can play around with those young guys a little bit and send them off for some aging vets.
And you talk about the difference in quarterback scoring between, let's say, like you said, quarterback 6 and 16. And I don't know how many times we said this, especially in the offseason. You want to go, you want to have at least 3 quarterbacks in every super flex league. It's not because of the difference in scoring, but it's because of the cost to acquire them. So if you're able to have guys that are going to be starters 3 to 5 years out and you have that position locked down, you're not going to have to take a loss in value later on to help that position. And that's why I think a guy like Matthew Stafford or Matt Ryan are perfect examples of veterans, especially Matt Ryan right now, coming back from the injury. The Falcons, they're in a terrible situation, but you might be able to get a slight discount. And we talked about not having to move these aging veterans just because you're in a rebuild. I have somebody that I talk to constantly, and we're always bouncing ideas off of each other. And a few times they ask me, hey, I'm in a rebuild. Should I move Matt Ryan for, X? And every single time I said no. Just because you're in a rebuild doesn't mean you have to move these pieces while they still have value. Again, 3 to 5 years out. So I think that's very important. Do you have anything else on quarterbacks, Mitch?
The only other thing that I wanted to bring up was one thing I've been doing in rebuilds this year is I've been trying to solidify my quarterbacks going into next year's draft, because I don't want to have to waste picks on quarterbacks, even though Tua's going to be awesome, Burrow's going to be awesome. Probably we project them to be at least, but I don't want to have to waste one of those first round 2020 picks on a quarterback and miss out on those running backs and wide receivers coming out.
All right, let me ask you a question. This is a perfect example, and this timed really well with what I was trying to do earlier in our 114-team Superflex League. So I have Josh Allen, I have Drew Lock, and I have Daniel Jones. And this is a full rebuild. I have very few assets at the running back, wide receiver position, but I was looking to move maybe Daniel Jones or Josh Allen in a 1-for-1 swap for a position player, probably a wide receiver. Again, it's a full rebuild. They're going to maintain their value, probably a little bit safer. And the reason I was going to do that, I have guaranteed the 101. So it's based on potential points. There is absolutely no way that my pick is not the 101 next year. So Mitch, let me ask you, based on what you just said, at what point are you okay moving? Now, again, my guys are Josh Allen and Daniel Jones in this league, but let's say it's somebody else for you. Are you okay moving one of those quarterbacks, knowing you have the 101 and you have the pick of the crop there next year at quarterback?
No, because I would rather have Swift or Taylor at that point. I would prefer not to have to draft Tua. I mean, it's going a little bit off note here, but it's Cincinnati and Miami. I don't think either of those teams are ready to put up huge quarterback points next year. So I would much rather get wherever Swift and Taylor end up going, but say one of them goes to Kansas City. You're going to have to take him at the 101 because he's just going to be solidified. And then you're going to be sitting there with one quarterback in a super flex league.
Okay. So, and that's a perfect explanation. I think it's a really good reasoning behind it as well. So like you said, just to reiterate, and correct me if I'm wrong, you are looking to have your 3 quarterbacks, even in a rebuild, locked down going into that 2020 draft. So you can use that draft capital on these crazy talented class coming out, at running back especially.
Yeah, exactly. And you could always trade that pick. If it ends up that Tua's the 101, there's going to be a team that needs a quarterback, man.
Right. Okay. Yeah, so I think we spent plenty of time on quarterbacks talking about what you should be doing in a rebuild and some things to avoid. I know that we said we weren't going to talk about specific players, but in these examples, we talked about Matthew Stafford and Matt Ryan specifically, but it's just an example. And again, you're going to be able to use that more looking at it from a general perspective, just talking about those aging veterans that still are going to have their job in the near future. Let's talk about running backs. And this is going to be really straightforward, I think. What are you doing with running backs? What's your overall strategy? Let's do the 2 side by side. So first, you have a full rebuild. You absolutely blew it up. You have 6 first-round picks next year, and you're lacking in pretty much every position right now.
we talked about this earlier in the offseason, so I think it's really important to reiterate it. The running back landscape is going to change next year. So I was looking on Dynasty League Football and their Devy rankings. So they have from 2020 through 2021 running backs and wide receivers and tight ends on there. And in the top 20 Devy rankings, and this is including a few 2021 wide receivers, there are 9 running backs coming out next year. We don't know who people are going to pick. We act like we know. All offseason, we're like, Houston's going to draft a running back and Tampa Bay's going to draft a running back, and they didn't touch one. And we could act like we know that Marlon Mack's can get replaced, but in the end of the day, we really have no idea. So I think entering a rebuild, you have to be willing to trade any running back that's pretty much not in the top 5 right now. And I'm talking Barkley, CMC, Zeke, Kamara, and Cook. And you could probably put Chubb in there. But other than that, every single running back on any team can be replaced next year.
So we talk about the landscape changing drastically, especially at the running back position. Not only are guys going to be replaced, but like we've been seeing more and more, we're going to see so many committees next year, and it really is going to water down the running back position as a whole. So I do agree with you, Mitch. I think unless you have one of the top 5 or so guys that you feel very confident in having their position and their role locked down in the offense they're in, you should be looking to move some pieces. So in a full rebuild, while I love guys like Chris Carson, Marlon Mack, Mark Ingram, even though he's a little bit older, those are guys that I'm absolutely looking to move in a full rebuild. If I'm a contender, I'm not moving them. I'm going to ride them out, and I'm going to look to win the championship this season because they're still going to be productive. But a full rebuild, they're absolutely getting moved. A partial rebuild, so we're talking about you moved 1 to 3 assets for future picks. I still think I'd be looking to move them. Of course, it's going to be very team specific. It's going to be very league specific because it's going to depend on the activity level of your league, like we talked about earlier. It's also going to depend on how people value certain positions. So if I'm able to get the value in return, I'm still looking to move those running backs in the 12 to 24 range from a dynasty perspective. So I completely agree. And I think that's a very obvious position there where that's the easiest one with this draft class coming out specifically next year to replace with a high-end asset. So I agree there. Like I said, it was going to be pretty straightforward from a running back perspective. Do you have anything else there?
No, I think we hit everything there. And you made a really good point with a partial rebuild is you still can't count on these guys. And I would look to move them too. I love, Josh Jacobs going into next year, but we don't know if they draft someone in the 3rd round.
One thing that I would be looking to do, move those running backs for a similarly valued wide receiver. So find those teams that were competing or are competing in 2019 that maybe suffered an injury. Maybe they were counting on Duke Johnson as their running back 3 and he's really not getting the job done. You're going to have very good luck moving, like I said, maybe a Marlon Mack for Calvin Ridley, arbitrarily picking him. But I think it's very important in these rebuilds to move these guys that could potentially not just lose their job, but maybe be put in a timeshare or committee next year for a piece that you can rely on. And that wide receiver is going to have a better chance of maintaining his value. So let's transition to the wide receivers then. So wide receivers and tight ends, what types of wide receivers or tight ends are you looking to target?
As far as tight end, I think we know who to target. There's 5 or 6 really good ones, and that's it. I'm not hoping to go out and find the next Darren Waller. We don't want to bring up specific guys, but he's a good point of tight ends are just so hard to predict. But wide receivers, on the other hand, I'm just looking for guys whose situation is going to be in a really good spot next year. Someone like, we're not bringing up individual.
No. Because I actually have a few guys that I want to specifically bring up. So go ahead.
Right.
Shoot to the moon here.
So it's just the situation that we're talking about here. And it's Christian Kirk. I loved him coming in to the season. His value really hasn't risen that much, but Larry Fitzgerald is either going to be gone next season or he's going to be playing a very limited role next season.
How many years in a row have we been saying that, though?
A lot, but I think he even said that he was coming back for this year to help coach up the young guys.
Right. So Christian Kirk. And what do you think about a guy like JJ Arcega-Whiteside? He had a lot of hype coming into the 2019 season. He's barely seen the field. He definitely hasn't produced. We said that he was kind of brought in. If you look at his measurables and his metrics, it's all Sean Jeffrey. So I think, what do you think about him?
Oh, he's a great point. And like any of those younger guys that are underperforming right now, they're such a good buy. Even Corey Davis. You're looking at the situation more than you're looking at the actual player. You don't want to go out and buy a guy like Sammy Watkins because his value really isn't going to change next year no matter what happens. It's going to Mike Williams. It's going to be the exact same going into next year. You are hoping to find a guy that will either be on a new team or one that has an aging vet going out, and that will help his market share go up a little bit because of that.
Right. And you talk about changing situations and maybe landing on a new team. It really is important to look at the contracts. I know we're in the middle of the season here, but if you're looking to rebuild, maybe go on. There's several different resources and look at the guys that are in the last year of their deal, and they could potentially be somewhere else next year. Because like we said, if you invest in them now, maybe at a lower cost, people have a tendency to inflate the values of players once they're in a new spot, and you might be able to move them just based off that value increase alone. So I think, trying to find guys where they're going to see the field a little bit more next year or a changing situation, those are great examples. And from a tight end perspective, that fits in perfectly with my guy. And I think you already know who it is. It's Ian Thomas. I've been talking about him since the offseason, and he has barely seen the field. Greg Olsen will just not go away. He's actually been pretty productive when he's been given the opportunity. Greg Olsen, that is. He's been quite the challenge for Ian Thomas to get out there, but I can't see Greg Olsen there next year. That's going to be Ian Thomas's position. He has been very productive when given the opportunity. So you're looking to acquire these pieces, and it's very difficult whenever these guys are on the rosters of people that are also rebuilding. And you've seen that, Mitch. We go out and we try to find players, whether we're a contender or a team that's rebuilding, and we target players where they're owned from somebody with a similar perspective. You can't buy them in that situation.
And then you'll also have the situations to where you'll go and send out a trade and it'll just sit there for a week because the guy's just inactive because he's already looking for next year. So like you said, it's really hard to target the individual players right now because some leagues you just might not be able to get them in the first place.
Right. There's a lot of information here. We try to be concise. I know at times we ramble, and I apologize, but Mitch just can't get me to shut up at times. But you look at these positions, and we talked about the different types of a rebuild. We have the full blow it up rebuild, and then we have the partial rebuild. So maybe you're not completely turning over your roster, but you are already looking ahead to next year. You have those two different situations, and we look at the different positions. So quarterback, we talked about what you can do there to help you gain additional draft capital. We talked about running back. Look to move those guys that are not absolutely locked into their role. We said we wanted to avoid specific players. Of course, we still threw them in. I knew it was going to happen. So those are the guys that you got to be looking to move. If they're not locked into the role, look to move them if you're in a rebuild. Maybe look to move them for a similarly valued wide receiver who's going to be able to help you, and then you use your picks that you have for the high-end running back talent coming out. And then we talked about wide receivers and tight ends. Look for guys that have changing situations, whether it's a new team or aging veterans leaving their team. So these are some different situations that you need to be looking at. You need to stay active. I think out of all the advice we've given, and Mitch, you're going to agree 100%, if you're not active in Dynasty, you're going to fall behind.
Yeah, it's such a great point. You bring that up all the time, and I completely agree.
One of the biggest issues, especially if we're not going to be active, you settle into that level of mediocrity. And if you're not competing like we've talked about, you should be looking to rebuild. Not a full-blown rebuild necessarily, but at least a partial rebuild, because you got to get into that next tier in your league next year. We rambled a little bit here, but a lot of good information, a lot of information in general. Hopefully this episode helps you along the way with your rebuilding journey. Thank you for listening to the Super Flexology Fantasy Football Show. I'm John Bauer. You can find me on Twitter at The Bauer Club. For Mitch Sorensen at DynoMC. Have a great night.
Thank you for listening to the Super Flexology Podcast. If you want the latest news in fantasy football, follow us on Twitter at Super Flexology, The Bauer Club, and DynoMC.